You will know exactly what the zone system is and how you can use it to improve your photos by the end of this video. Not only will you have more confidence when you go out to take pictures, you will also be able to more easily manage the negatives in your darkroom and ultimately make better prints. And I've even included some tips for using it with roll film like 35mm and 120. So real quick, I want to go over what the zone system is not, because I feel this is really important. The zone system is not going to automatically make your pictures better per se. It's not going to improve crappy lighting. It's not going to improve bad composition. And it's kind of like comparing it to, say, a fiber-based print in the darkroom. Nobody really cares. Just because it was produced in the darkroom, it doesn't make it a better image. Same with this. If it's a bad image, nobody's going to care that you use the zone system to make it. So what the heck is the zone system anyway? The zone system was developed by Ansel Adams and Fred Archer as a means of exposing and developing film so that they could pre-visualize and determine what the final values would look like in the print. The final values they saw in the scene would ultimately look like in the final print. So straight from Ansel Adams himself in his book, The Negative, the zone system allows us to relate various luminances of a subject with the gray values from black to white that we visualize to represent each one in the final image. So the cool part is it enables us to get really predictable results from our materials and our equipment. But more importantly, it gives us a really powerful tool to place values in a scene for creative expression. So the zone system also specifically deals with the problem of the huge range of latitude we find in nature, just the crazy amounts of contrast that we can find or lack thereof. And it helps us place those tones that we take onto specific ranges of our paper that have a much more limited range. I mean, when you're out shooting, you could encounter a crazy amount of contrast all the way down to something that has little to no contrast. And that can cause you to either print something that's dull and lifeless or nearly impossible to get all the detail that you want onto the paper. So it allows us to get proper exposure on the negative along with proper development of the negative to get the correct density for the desired predetermined print value. So we want to take what we see in nature with our eyes and our brain, which is this just insanely complex system. You can think of it as having like multiple apertures all the time and your brain's processing this information. So by taking in all that information and knowing what our camera and materials can do, we can take all that data, pre-visualize what we want with that data, and ultimately output it onto the more limited range of paper. And the really cool part is you can take these tones that you see and you can place them wherever you want, as close to or as far from reality as you see fit for your creative vision. So I also think it's very important to understand that when they developed the zone system, it was specifically for printing with negatives onto fixed grade paper. Now, materials and everything have evolved quite a bit with variable contrast. We can use split grade printing. We have quite a bit more flexibility since this was first developed. And basically what that means is we have an easier time of controlling the final contrast at the time of printing. But there is still a ton of value and power in being able to visualize what you want those tones to look like and having a good system in place for achieving them. And if you break it down to the foundational building block of what's going on, it's expose for the shadows and develop for the highlights at predetermined ranges. So you know what that exposure and what that development is going to give you on your print. Now, before we actually jump into how you can use the zone system to improve your photography, I need you to smash that subscribe button. I put out a new video like this every week and you are not going to want to miss them. So using the zone system. So the zone system is gonna break up the values in your final print into 11 different shades of white to black. And these are called the zones. And each zone is gonna represent one stop of light. And again, straight from Ansel Adams' book, The Negative, these are the different descriptions he gives of the zones. The low values, zone 0, total black in the print, no useful density in the negative other than film base plus fog. Zone 1, effective threshold. First step above complete black in the print, with slight tonality but no texture. Zone 2, first suggestion of texture, deep tonalities representing the darkest part of the image in which some slight detail is required. Zone 3, average dark materials and low values showing adequate texture. Middle values. Zone 4, average dark foliage, dark stone, or landscape shadow. Normal shadow value for Caucasian skin portraits in sunlight. Zone 5, middle gray, clear north sky as rendered by panchromatic film, dark skin, gray stone, average weathered wood. Zone 6, average Caucasian skin value in sunlight, diffuse skylight or artificial light. Light stone, shadows on snow and sunlit landscapes, clear north sky on panchromatic film with light blue filter. The high values. Zone 7, very light skin, light gray objects, average snow with acute side lighting. Zone 8, whites with texture and delicate values, textured snow, highlights on Caucasian skin. Zone 9, white without texture approaching pure white, thus comparable to Zone 1 in its slight tonality without true texture. Snow in flat sunlight, with small format negatives printed with condenser larger, Zone 9 may print as pure white, not distinguishing from Zone 10. Zone 10, pure white of the printing paper base, specular glare or light sources in the picture area. So for the best results, you are going to want to use a spot meter for the zone system. And when you meter in the scene with that 1 degree spot, that individual place you're metering off of, the meter will give you an EV value along with a corresponding exposure setting. If you take that exposure, that should give that spot zone 5 or the mid gray in the zone system. So the best way to do this is, again, we want to expose for the shadows. So you're gonna wanna find an area in the scene you want to have adequate shadow detail and base your exposure off of that. Now, when taking a meter reading of these areas, if you were to get an EV of 10, you'd simply place that exposure value next to either zone 3 or 4, depending on how much shadow detail you want, and that would give you the proper exposure for the shadows. It's important to note that most light meters do provide film sensitivity adjusted EV readings. One exception is the Pentax digital spot meter, so just make sure you know how your meter is reading the actual EV values. The easiest way I have found by far to place different tones in your scene on different zones that you want them is to use this zone and EV gauge or a zone dial or slider. And this way you're just using the EV numbers. You're not doing a bunch of mental gymnastics trying to figure out f-stops and shutter speeds for what zone 6, 7, and 8 are gonna be. You can just simply look at it and say, oh, well, 3 stops up, that from 4, that is 7. So if the EV shadow detail falls on zone 10, I can immediately just see that 13 in the scene is gonna fall on zone 7. So it just eliminates the mental drain of having to figure all that out. And like I said, many light meters will give you an EV value. And on the Pentax one is in particularly great because it gives you the EVs right here and you can match things up right as you go. And then you will have your exposure based right off of that on the meter. But you can definitely use any meter that will give you an exposure value. And what the exposure value is, it gives you a specific aperture and shutter for that value. So in this example, I metered off the shadow area under the bridge and it gave me an EV value of 10. I took the 10 on the scale and placed it in front of zone 4. I wanted adequate shadow detail in this area. This gave me a proper exposure of 1/8 of a second at f22 for those shadows. And I feel it's important to note too that zone 4 is basically like taking a meter reading of the shadows and then just underexposing that by 1 stop. So now I have the exposure done for the film. So in this example, again, I took a meter reading off of the brightest value near the arch, and that gave me an EV reading of 15. So this EV on the scale, when I looked over, 15 was falling on zone 9 based on me exposing EV 10 at zone 4. So the contrast is essentially 1 stop too bright for me to just print that very easily on my normal printing paper, normal filter. And the really, really wonderful thing about black and white film is that we can increase or decrease the contrast through development. So I really, really love the analogy that Bruce Barnbaum gives in his book, The Art of Photography. He uses this bellows analogy, a simple way to grasp the concept of progressively increased densities with extended development times and progressively reduced density with shortened development times is to think of each successive zone as a number on the successive pleats of a camera bellows, or any type of bellows. When development begins, the bellows are crunched down completely and each zone placement has zero density. As development progresses, the bellows are slowly extended to the right from the fixed point on the left so that the pleats, or zones, separate from one another, meaning they separate in density. The longer the development time, the further the bellows are extended to the right, and the greater the density of the higher zones up to the maximum negative density. So in essence, what he's saying, if you look at this chart, when you first start development, everything kind of develops the same. Then with more extended development, the middle and highlight densities build up much faster and more than the low densities. The low densities kind of stay the same. So that is how you can either expand the contrast or reduce the contrast. And that's why we say develop for the highlights. So back to this example, by giving the shadows adequate exposure at zone 4, and then knowing that the sky had a value of zone 9 and reducing development, bringing that value to zone 8 on the negative density, I was able to easily print that picture on my normal grade paper. And I will note too that with reduced development, you do have to give it, usually for each stop, I give it about a third more exposure. And that brings me to testing. So testing is kind of at the heart of the zone system, and that's because you want to have predictable results. So everybody's cameras are going to be slightly different shutters, different meters, different times, temperatures, all this stuff, and it comes down to knowing what you're using. The testing can vary significantly. It can get very technical with plotting curves and sensonometry and very analytical, all the way to kind of my more favorite, which is to go out and take pictures with the same film, same developer, keep things consistent, and take notes. And at first, just bracket a little bit on your initial exposures for the shadows. And once you're getting really good shadow detail, very easily printable, and your highlights are either not quite bright enough or they're too bright, you can just adjust from there. So if your highlights are just constantly blown out on using a number 2 filter, you're gonna wanna reduce your development just a little, maybe 15%. And then if you're getting really flat negatives, the next sheet or whatever, develop it a little bit longer, maybe 15%. So I really like real world testing because it gets you out taking pictures. But my ultimate advice would be, especially if you're just getting involved in this, don't get too worked up over the analytical, like you need to have everything tested perfectly side of things. Go out, take pictures of normal contrast scenes, higher contrast scenes, make sure you're getting good exposures for the shadow, and then play around with your development times till you know those materials. And it's very important to use the same film, the same developer, and be consistent with everything. And make sure you take notes, and you will really get to know the film and how it reacts to shadows and highlights and development and all that just by using it over time. And then if you want to really get into it more in depth, then you can start looking at actually measuring your film densities and measuring your print densities and things like that. And now finally, for the roll film tips that I promised you. We can definitely take these zone system principles and apply them to roll film. And what I do is when I am out shooting a roll, if there is an image that I just love and it's on a roll with other contrast images, I will develop it for that single image. And that might mean that some of the other images are higher contrast and some of them are lower contrast. But I'm okay with that because especially the more I work in the darkroom and the more tools I have, it's not that difficult for me to deal with high contrast and low contrast images. And ultimately, I want my favorite image to be developed as close to perfect as possible. And in really, really extreme cases, I do have multiple film backs for like my Hasselblad, or you could take multiple camera bodies and you could have one back for high contrast, one back for normal, and one for low contrast shots if you want to do that. I really don't, unless there is an extreme situation. I will load a different back and shoot it with that. But those are pretty few and far between. And one final tip, if you are out shooting with a camera with a built-in light meter, one really quick kind of down and dirty way to get good exposure in your shadows and place them where I like to place them is take the camera, get close to the shadow area, fill the frame with the shadow, not to be casting a shadow, but fill the frame if you're able to, and then underexpose by one stop. That will put those shadows at zone 4 by default. Then just simply gauge the scene. Is it high contrast? Is it about normal contrast? Or is it really low contrast? And then develop accordingly. That is how I do most of my shots through anything that has a built-in meter. I don't try to get too technical. I do rely on using variable contrast papers, flashing, split grade printing, masking if I have to. I'm not afraid to use those other tools in the toolbox. So at the end of the day, the zone system is a tool, and you want to get as many of your negatives to a very easily and manageable printable picture as possible. And that's what it's for. But I'm not gonna let it ruin my day just getting too nitpicky over getting everything perfect. You're never going to get everything within a third stop. There's too many variables. So you're always gonna be a little bit on or off. And the idea is to get it as close as you can. And if you want to keep learning, check out this video on the extended zone system right here.